and let's continue our field identification of some of the native pines to parts of the Ohio Valley and much of the Appalachian region and some of the lower Great Lakes. The ones I'm finding today here are confined mostly to the Appalachians and the uppermost part of the Ohio Valley, where it's in the Appalachian foothills. And I'm going to do a review of the pitch pine today and introduce a new one called Virginia pine, which is common in the Appalachian Mountains. It's common on these rock ledges where I do a lot of my hiking in Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And it's common even in the lowlands of Pennsylvania and some of the shale barren areas and areas of poor soil that used to be farmland. So it's not always on the mountaintops in Pennsylvania, but can be just about anywhere in the central part of Pennsylvania, growing in the exhausted farmlands that are of poor soil quality. But here it's sharing on a sandstone knob here. This is called the Jacob's Ladder. This is in Fairfield County, Ohio. This is part of the Christmas Rocks Nature Preserve. And what I have done is I have found a pitch pine here to my right with needles of 3 that are about 3 to 4 inches long, so bunches of 3. And growing right next to it is a Virginia pine with needles of 2 that are about 1.5 inches or 2 inches long. Let's get them in closer view right here. And what I have is the Virginia pine needles on the right here. They come in bunches of 2 and they are twisted together, often like this bunch on the right, and kind of wrap around each other. And they are barely 2 inches long, and the cone, if you put this here for scale, is barely 2 inches long and kind of slender. The pitch pine, which was sharing this mountainside, has a cone it likes to roll around. There we go. That cone is just a little bit longer and a little bit stouter than the Virginia pine cone. The pitch pine is on the right, Virginia pine on the left. And the pitch pine needles are quite a bit longer than the Virginia pine needles. Let's put them together here. So the pitch pine needles on the left there, twice as long, and they come in 3s instead of 2s. So that's a good way to tell them apart. The cones are slightly different. This Virginia pine cone on the left here does have some nice prickles on it. Some of the pitch pines do as well. This one doesn't. And I just happened to bring this Table Mountain pine cone along from a few weeks ago because the Table Mountain pine and the Virginia pine both have needles in bunches of 2. But the Table Mountain pine cone and needles on the top of the screen here are much longer. Those needles are in bunches of 2, but they're probably 3 inches long instead of 2 inches long. And they're slightly more yellow, and the Virginia pine needles are more green, or darker green. And the Virginia pine cones are much smaller than the Table Mountain pine cones. So there'd be no confusing the trees from the cones. The needles without cones could be confused, but I think you got quite a bit of difference in length and color, as well as the texture of the bark. I don't have the Table Mountain pine here in Ohio to film, but this Virginia pine bark has got much smaller plates. It's in the background here. I'll zoom in a little. Much smaller plates than anything I found with Table Mountain pine. The plates and chunks on the bark are 2 to 3 inches long. And the pitch pine, which is also sharing this mountainside, has chunks that are quite a bit larger, probably the size of a dollar bill here. These trees got wet yesterday, so the bark is a lot darker in color than it would be on a dry day. But you know, sometimes we have to hike right after rainstorms, so it's good to be able to identify the bark when it's wet as well as dry. So here we got 2 native pines. And just for good measure, I do happen to have a little white pine growing here. And here's our white pine growing right behind these Virginia pines. and pitch pines. There's a little seedling here, and it's not unheard of to find all three in the same hillside. These white pines are much softer to the touch. They're called white pine because there's a white stripe between the green on the needle, so it's got a little white stripe in it. If you look closely, you can see that. So it's got more of a whitish hue. The needles are soft to the touch, much thinner, and they come in bunches of 5. And I did quite a long clip on the white pine a few weeks ago, so we've got one in the background here. White pine is growing on a little deeper soil than the other two, the Virginia pine, which is right here, and the pitch pine, which is in the background. So this is a good habitat for pines in a part of the country where it's actually got a lot of hardwoods as well. You can see across the valley there, it's mostly hardwoods. So this just happens to be exposed because there's a rock ledge underneath and creates a unique habitat for these plants.